Welcome everyone to this webinar on Sub-Saharan Africa Risk Outlook, Internationalization of Protracted Conflicts and Faltering Responses. My name is Benjamin Petrini. I'm a research fellow in the Conflict, Security and Development Program here at the Institute. We're a research program that monitors armed conflict and domestic instability globally and implications on international security and the global landscape of fragility and armed conflict. Our team curates the IISS yearly flagship publication on armed conflict survey, and the 2022 edition is about to come out in October. This webinar today is part of our series on regional risk outlook, which is a regular webinar series where we try to sort of take stock of the main trends on conflict and security in different regions, and we analyze political risk factors, impact and implications, and we look at sort of what are the policy responses and the outlook going forward. The focus of today's conversation will be on the landscape of armed conflicts and on regional security. Can I have the slide up, please? There are many issues, obviously, to look on this topic. I think the first point we want to make, and we will talk about, is around the trends in violence. And very quickly, I just want to run this through you to show how armed conflicts has increased steadily since in the last decade and has actually skyrocketed since 2014-15. The number of conflict-affected states, though, has remained, if we look at the level of the 1990s, more or less the same. And this tells us that the core of conflict-affected countries actually do have more than one conflict, and that speaks to the complexity of armed conflict on the continent. Another main feature that we will talk about is the internationalization of conflict, and we see here the orange line, where the civil wars with external intervention have become much more prominent. But I don't want to anticipate all the discussion. We would talk about some of the hotspots and look at the arc of conflict that goes from the Western Sahel all the way to the Horn of Africa. And we would try to avoid, while talking about regional trends, we will try to avoid main generalizations, but also we want to balance a bit some overarching trends, but avoiding generalizations and recognizing the specificities of countries and also of subregions. One feature that I'm actually very excited to talk about is the one around protractedness and the intractability of conflict. Which also would lead us to talk about the policy responses and the interventions, and the interventions in terms of peacekeeping, of stabilisation, and of counterterrorism, and look not only at the effectiveness, their effectiveness of not being effective, but also to the extent which they are fit for purpose, and if they are the right tools for the issues at stake. So let me quickly introduce our four speakers that are here today with us. Emily Estelle is a research fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, AEI, in Washington, D.C., and the research manager of AEI's Critical Threats Project, which provides open source intelligence analysis on the Salafi Jihadi movement and on Iran. We have with us Giovanni Faleg, who's a senior analyst at the European Union Institute for Security Studies in Paris, where he's responsible for Sub-Saharan Africa. and he focuses on Africa's state fragility and on the EU's engagement in the region on peace and security, among other things. Then we have Ivan Yende Ilunga, who is an assistant professor of political science and international relations at Salve Regina University in Newport, Rhode Island, and serves as deputy director for the Joint Civil-Military Interaction Research and Education Network. And last but not least, we have Surer Kasim Mohammed, who is the Harry Frank Guggenheim Research Fellow at Pembroke College, University of Cambridge in the UK. Her research focuses on the politics of urban belonging in Africa, the aftermath of political violence in cities, and on Somali politics. So before we start, just some quick logistics. The webinar will be for 1 hour and 15 minutes. We will have a first set of remarks by our guest for around 5 to 7 minutes each, and that will be followed by a second round of questions and interactions, and then we will open to Q&A from the audience. You can type your question at any time in the Q&A box on your screen, and then I will relate your question during that time. Now, let me turn to Emily from AEI first. And Emily, do you want to kick us off in talking about some of the overarching trends in conflict and violence and in terrorist groups and how you see the landscape of conflict?
Sure. Happy to get started with a bright and positive topic as per usual for my research. And good morning, everyone from DC. So thank you so much first, Dr. Petrini, for having me. And I'm really excited to join this panel and learn from my co-panelists. So as Dr. Petrini said, I'm at AEI in DC, and my work focuses on the Salafi Jihadi movement globally, so Al-Qaeda, the Islamic State, and associated groups and movements. So that's the perspective that I'll be speaking from, but I'll also try and address some of the cross-cutting trends here. So what I was thinking of kicking off with was an overview of both some of the major trends that I see kind of across the continent and across the world in terms of jihadism, but then also go region by region to try and weave those themes in with an introduction to the individual groups that are most active or most important right now for those who haven't been immersed in this part of studying conflict in Africa. So the first theme, when talking about Salafi jihadi groups like Al-Qaeda, like the Islamic State, like Al-Shabaab, others, is that the overarching objective for these groups is actually a governance objective. We think of them as terror groups, and they use terrorism as a tactic, but fundamentally they're seeking to overturn systems of governance by force and install their own version. So keeping that goal in mind is really important for assessing how these groups are doing on their own terms. Are they proceeding towards their own goals or not? And I would say one of the overarching themes in sub-Saharan Africa over the past decade is that several jihadist groups have actually made quite a bit of progress towards this goal, not only by expanding in territory, but by also kind of deepening their laying deeper roots and really establishing themselves in a way that's made them very difficult to uproot. And that's because, in part, these groups are able to operate within the complex conflicts that Dr. Petrini had on his slide also. So that change in conditions over time has been favorable for jihadist groups seeking to govern by force. Second theme, and a debate that we have very often in jihadism studies, is that jihadist groups can kind of operate on a spectrum of local to global objectives. And this is often quite a debate on whether groups that brand themselves Islamic State or Al-Qaeda are actually part of that group. How much do they actually adhere to those objectives? How concrete is that relationship? As with most good answers, the actual answer is that it's a little bit of both and varies for all of them. But the main point that I want to make is that even quite localized groups can gain concrete benefits from kind of signing up to one of these larger organizations, and the global organizations in turn draw legitimacy, resources, resiliency from having this local support base. So there's a push and pull there on this local and global spectrum. third theme is that the Salafi Jihadi movement or the counterterrorism portfolio doesn't exist in isolation. There's, of course, interaction with geopolitical competition, with other domestic political dynamics, regional dynamics. And so the interplay between, say, great power competition and the role of external military forces or of alliances, that has an effect on the counterterrorism space and also the environment in which jihadist groups are operating. So, I've done various work on how external forces have interacted with counterterrorism, and those forces can either contribute to a more hostile environment for jihadist groups or a more permissive environment for them. So counterterrorism doesn't exist in its own bubble. So now I want to kind of move around to the main regions where we've got active jihadist groups to introduce them and also start to talk about how these themes play in. So I'll start in West Africa in the Sahel region, particularly Mali and Burkina Faso. So Mali has been the kind of epicenter state for jihadism in the Sahel for quite some time now. The Sahel crisis has now been going on for a decade, kicked off in 2012. And the kind of origin of what we're seeing today was kind of al-Qaeda linked groups, including al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb and kind of its larger network, co-opting a rebellion in northern Mali and basically seizing the opportunity to ultimately establish an emirate that was then pretty quickly crushed by both the Malian resistance and the French intervention. But what's happened since is that conflict has protracted. And when I say that conflict, we're talking about a bunch of multi-layered conflicts over kind of a large swath of northern and central Mali. Jihadist groups have really evolved in this space over this time, most obviously by spreading southward. So originally this was mostly a northern Mali issue. Now there's a huge amount of terror activity in central Mali, and it's spread over the borders into particularly Burkina Faso, which has seen significant destabilization and mass displacement and violence over the last couple of years. The names of the individual groups that are involved in this has varied over time, and I won't subject you to the alphabet soup that is all of the relationships that have changed. But the primary groups to be aware of right now, the main al-Qaeda linked group is called JNIM or JNIM, the acronym from the Arabic. I'll say JNIM, but you'll hear a lot of things. And that group formed in 2017 as a merger of a kind of bunch of or four main groups that are already active that each have a slightly different character, different ties, different ethnic composition, different geographic focus, even different skill sets that merged under this umbrella. The other main group to be aware of is the Islamic State branch that's active in the Sahel, sometimes known as the Islamic State in the Greater Sahara, which actually splintered off from the kind of larger al-Qaeda network and pledged to the Islamic State several years back. And those two groups, JNIM and the Islamic State group, are rivals in this space. So out of this complicated web of organizations, there are a couple of major trends. One, unfortunately, is that the violence towards civilians in the Sahel has continued to ramp up, and 2022 has been a particularly violent year so far, not just because of jihadist attacks on civilians, but also because of security force attacks on civilians in Mali and in Burkina Faso. And I highlight that not just because it's terrible and noteworthy in its own right, but also because a key factor in the spread of jihadist groups in West Africa has been popular grievances against security forces who are also putting basically local populations in an impossible choice between jihadist groups and military forces and are subjected to abuses from both sides. This trend has gotten worse in Mali, particularly in the last year, but since the takeover of the military junta and the arrival of the Wagner group, and I know others on this call will talk about Russia, I'm sure, but to flag that here, I see the involvement of particularly the Russian paramilitary forces as contributing to an even worse environment in terms of a governance competition between jihadist groups and the Malian government. One other major trend in the Sahel is that this problem is continuing to spread. So several Gulf of Guinea states have started to experience more spillover violence along their northern borders coming out of Mali and out of Burkina Faso. It's still, I would say, relatively minor compared to the countries that I've been talking about, but it's something to flag that the Gulf of Guinea states are now facing a higher risk of more jihadist activity as these groups continue to expand their area of operations and as kind of general instability in the Sahel becomes entrenched and continues to grow. Now to move to another part of West Africa to introduce that, the Lake Chad Basin is also a hotspot for Salafi jihadism on the continent, particularly looking at northeastern Nigeria, which you'll be familiar with as kind of the longtime base for Boko Haram. The last 5 or 7 years have seen a lot of quite interesting, I guess, interesting from a jihadism studies perspective, changes in how Boko Haram and now subsequent groups function. Boko Haram was always a little bit odd when you look at the whole spread of global jihadist groups because it never quite linked up to Al-Qaeda for a variety of reasons that I could get into. And so it was always quite locally focused in a way that that meant, you know, kind of the global counterterrorism focus was a little bit different for Boko Haram because it was having these horrible effects locally, but hadn't really signaled broader intent. What started to shift is that Boko Haram, or at least parts of it, had pledged allegiance to the Islamic State several years ago through kind of some complicated splits in leadership competition within the group that really persist to this day. And the Islamic State's West Africa branch, as part of that organization is now known, is now a pretty significant component of the Islamic State organization globally in that it features really heavily in Islamic State propaganda now the last several years. And also the Islamic State has supplied some trainers and expertise to try and make the group in Nigeria more tactically effective. I don't want to overstate the nature of this relationship, but it is a significant change within the context of this region to have this more globally focused group with a pretty significant base of operations in northern Nigeria. Now, the actually more concerning thing about that is that Islamic State West Africa province isn't even the top security threat for the Nigerian state. And if you've been reading about Nigerian security the last couple of years, one of the big changes has been the destabilization of parts of the Northwest, the rise of, you'll hear, banditry or warlordism, and that environment has also created some opportunities for jihadist groups within it. So we've seen the Islamic State groups start to be more active outside of northeastern Nigeria, closer to the capital region or even into the capital region. And there's also an Al-Qaeda linked group called Ansaru that had been dormant for quite some time that's become active again in the Northwest. So for Nigeria, I see several overlapping security dynamics, one of which is the jihadism piece, and those groups have been able to evolve within that fairly chaotic environment in certain regions of the country. And there are some alarming developments as far as expanding of their geographic reach. Now, let me jump completely over to Eastern Africa briefly to introduce just a couple more groups. I had already mentioned Al-Shabaab in Somalia, and that's the primary group in Eastern Africa. It's a flagship Al-Qaeda affiliate at this point, a long-running protracted insurgency. Al-Shabaab has kind of de facto control over pretty significant terrain, quite significant terrain through southern Somalia. Some estimates it draws in as much revenue as the Somali government. And so the question of kind of Al-Shabaab's future is, very deeply tied in with the future of the Somali state. It's an interesting moment to be talking about Al-Shabaab, actually, because by some measures, the group, looks quite strong. I'm sure you've seen the news from several weeks ago about the siege in Mogadishu. Recently, there's also an Al-Shabaab incursion into Ethiopia, which was new. And the group is generally active throughout many parts of the country. At the same time, there is some backlash against it, particularly in central Somalia right now, where there's been both kind of federal government and local mobilization pushing back on Al-Shabaab. So but looking long term, Shabab has weathered a lot of this push and pull over the years, and so question of what would actually change things significantly away from the status quo is a very live one. From a kind of global counterterror perspective, Shabab is also noteworthy because it has attempted, both promised and attempted transnational attacks. It's started to try and target international aviation over the last several years, which of course means it may enter a different category as far as the number of countries that are immediately concerned with its activities. Finally, there's also an Islamic State group in Somalia that's smaller, but it's a splinter group off of al-Shabaab that also plays a regional coordination role for the Islamic State. Last groups I'll mention very briefly. In 2019, the Islamic State declared its Central Africa province with components in the DRC and in Mozambique. And so this was another indicator of the expansion of just the number and the location of jihadist groups in Africa. DRC especially is an example of kind of the classic case where you've got a pre-existing insurgency that then through a leadership change signed up to be part of the Islamic State, and there's still a live debate over kind of how close that relationship is, but there have been changes in how that group has operated. It also kind of started to focus again on terror attacks in Uganda, though that was fairly short-lived. And then the Mozambique insurgency has also become quite persistent in northern Mozambique, and it's weathered significant pressure over the last year or so and has continued to conduct attacks. So that's also a worrisome trend where there are a lot of questions about kind of how much, the Islamic State leadership is really involved. But even setting that aside, these local insurgencies have really been able to root themselves and also expand in a way that's created significant security problems for at least one state and usually several. So with that not so rosy picture of the status of jihadist groups in Africa, I'll wrap up there. The main idea that I want to get across is that jihadist groups aren't the main driver of instability generally. They tend to be beneficiaries of it, of existing negative governance or security trends. They succeed the most when they can kind of slot themselves into another intractable conflict. And then the presence of jihadist groups tends to make these conflicts even harder to resolve. So I'll leave it there. I'm excited to hear from the other panelists and to get into discussion.
Thank you very much for this very comprehensive and brief overview where you touched upon groups, on dynamics, and on hotspots. So I think this was very comprehensive, and I take away a very interesting point that you said on the local global interactions between these groups, and that both type of groups take advantage. Mutually take advantage of issues that make them, let's say, even stronger and convenient to have these type of interactions. And I guess there will be more on the discussion on how some of these features that you mentioned are sort of features that are common to insurgencies, normal insurgencies as we know, and other features that instead introduce very new and much more complex dynamics. Let me turn to Giovanni Falek from the European Union Institute for Security Studies. Giovanni, can you talk us a bit to complexify even more the picture that Emily started off with around the internationalization of conflicts and around the geopolitical issues resulting obviously from the war on Ukraine, from the global geopolitical competition between US and China, and how is that all playing out on the continent? Thank you. Over to you.
Thank you, Benjamin. Absolutely. So let us first look at the world we live in today. This multipolar world has two main features. The first one is that it is more competitive than we expected initially to be, because powers scramble to project influence in other regions and to secure access to food, energy, resources, and technology. So they compete. But in some cases, this multipolar world becomes hostile, as some of those actors feel legitimate to resort to conventional or hybrid warfare to advance their strategic interests. So that's the reality we live in. Now, Africa, the sub-Saharan Africa in particular, is at the very center of this new geopolitical reality. And in this context, a growing number of countries in the African continent are symptomatic. What do I mean by that? I'm not talking about COVID symptoms, of course. I'm referring to detectable signs of institutional fragility and the pain they cause to societies and to people. Now, we can have several examples of that from the difficult transitions in Sudan, civil war in Ethiopia, military coup in West Africa, insurgency in northern Mozambique, and so on and so forth. So those are signs of fragility that, overlapping with the new geopolitical circumstances, make the conflict risk outlook very difficult. Now, in all this, we've had two major shocks in the past 2 years, the COVID-19 pandemic and the 2022 Ukraine war, that have further changed and accelerated previously existing trends. And challenges to peace and security right now have been back at the forefront of policy debates when it comes to sub-Saharan Africa. Let me just remind you that back in 2019, the narrative vis-a-vis Africa was much more oriented towards economic growth, positive transformation, in some cases democratization. Now we are sort of back to a very different situation. And if I think from the point of view of European Union and European Union member states' engagement with Africa, many of the partnership priorities that are identified by the EU, as well as by the latest African Union, European Union summit, are, simply put it, very difficult to work with institutional stability, with those signs of fragility. So the objective of supporting resilience in African states and society, which is one of the core objectives of the European Union global strategy, works very difficult way if states are under control of military juntas or if institutional fragility worsens. Therefore, starting from that outlook, let me just give you 2 quick points which can help understand the new risk outlook in the continent. And for each point, let me address specifically the impact of the Russian invasion of Ukraine first, as well as how, from the point of view of Europe, of the European Union, relations with African partners have been adjusted. So the first point is about shifting geopolitics. I briefly referred to that in my introduction. Now, there are currently many languages of power in Africa. And as I said, it's not just about competition for investment or trade. The spaces of geopolitical competition are manifold, and so are the threats that they cause to African and other countries' security. Let me mention 2. One is the information space, where attempts to discredit the European Union and fuel anti-Western rhetoric proliferate, influencing citizen perceptions for political gains. And of course, Russia is actively pursuing foreign interference and manipulation of information, which greatly contributes to that in many African countries. But so are other actors. And then there is the space of governance, which is also contested, with the EU and other Western like-minded actors supporting democracy, rule of law, elections, while other actors, such as Russia, openly back military rule. And in this context, we have, of course, global rivalries that also intensify for other reasons in the Western Indian Ocean, Red Sea, the Gulf of Guinea was mentioned before, and so on and so forth. Now, against this backdrop, there have been immediate implications of the Ukraine war, as major global powers are seeking, as we speak, to conquer African hearts and mind. This is because African countries' response to the war has been one of non-alignment, and therefore the attempt by global power is to push them to one side or the other, which of course creates a certain instability altogether. Noteworthy are the recent visits by France. Macron was in Cameroon, Benin, Guinea-Bissau in July, and in Algeria in August, but also by Russia, with Lavrov going to Ethiopia, Egypt, Uganda, Congo-Brazzaville, and there will be the upcoming Russian-Africa Summit in Ethiopia, and the United States with Blinken visits to South Africa, DRC, and Rwanda shortly after Lavrov. Now, of course, by winning those hearts and minds, of course, we have a feeling of deja vu from the Cold War, which is not necessarily appreciated from our African counterparts. And this creates indeed some risks of deterioration and internalization of conflicts. We have a case in point, for instance, in Ethiopia, given the fact that Russia openly supports the federal government offensive in Tigray, whereas, of course, the position from European Union and United States is a bit different in that respect. Now, this could fuel, of course, the stabilization. This and other examples like this could fuel the stabilization in the continent. Implication for the European Union, there is a general sense of frustration, of course, given the fact that Africa has not chosen side since the vote at the United Nations General Assembly. But honestly, from an expert point of view, a different scenario could hardly be expected. It was known that an alignment will not necessarily take place under the present conditions. And at this moment, there is closer cooperation with African countries for energy needs, as well as for imperative to pursue African Union European agenda as a follow-up from the summit. So we can see European Union trying to leverage a Team Europe and a global gateway approach to get closer to its African counterparts and maintain its contribution to security through CSDP mission and operations, so traditional crisis management, through the European Peace Facility, and through a lot of support that the European Union provides. But let me stress that in the current context of geopolitical competition, stabilization and providing stability due to those competing influences by other global actors can prove much more challenging. Second point, quickly into that, new threats to stability. So the conflict landscape in Africa has deteriorated in many ways. Two things can be highlighted in that respect. One was mentioned very clearly by Emily and has to do with violent extremism trends. So I will not go into that because the previous presentation was exhaustive. Let me just say that still violent extremism still costs the region an estimated $97 billion in informal economy activity lost each year. But then the second main challenge that we see from our analytical standpoint is hybrid threats, which are rising in the continent. We see them in the Central African Republic, in Mali, as well as in other countries. Here, hybrid actors tend to target and exploit situations of fragility, capitalizing in the inability of governments to be resilient about this type of operation. And from our analytical studies, we outline a growing risk that some African countries may become operational hubs for growing hybrid activities. And this would, of course, deteriorate transnational security in the continent. When it comes to implications of the Ukraine war, well, one of the main topics lately has been the food crisis. Of course, there's not here causality with increasing fragility, but there is at least a correlation with that through the exacerbation of root causes of fragility induced by the food crisis. There's also political impact of the war, which is felt particularly in the Sahel, where the Russian presence combined with the withdrawal of French Operation Barkhane has created greater insecurity and paved the way for reconfiguration of the security architecture. And implications seen from Europe, of course, all these point to the fact that contribution to African security cannot be business as usual. So this will likely entail a change of approach, whether it's about reconfiguration of assistance in the Sahel, to create first line of defense against both traditional threats as well as the Russian influence, but also stronger emphasis on humanitarian support, more strategic approach towards hybrid operations, and trying to have more effective and constructive relations with African partners. Now, to conclude, we have new political and geopolitical realities that draw a dangerous line between African conflicts and global geopolitical dynamics, a process that, as I said, has been accelerated by the Ukraine war. Are there ways to mitigate that? I would probably give you a little bit of suspense, stop here, and may give you a couple of recommendations later on in the second round of discussion. Let me just anticipate that solutions to mitigate this spiral on instability, to me at least, have to do with a people factor that is not taken into account enough in geopolitical calculations, at least so far. But I will stop here and give you those elements later.
Thanks very much, Giovanni. Very, very rich and provoking issues that you put on the table. I actually, from the perspective of the EU that you mentioned, I find very interesting this institutional fragility, which is deteriorating, and autocracies that are rising make it much more difficult to conduct a policy dialogue and a policy dialogue between external countries that is productive. Let me turn now to Ivan Ilunga from Salve Regina University. Ivan, what are your thoughts on the responses, on the current responses today to armed conflict in terms of peacekeeping, in terms of stabilisation? Give us a bit an overview of your thoughts and how you think that these are effective or not to the challenges that have been set so far.
Great. Thank you so much, Benjamin. And it's good to be here, and greetings to the panelists as well as colleagues who are connected. I guess I will try to be a little bit brief and give more chance for Q&A and pick up on a few things that Emily and Giovanni already said, especially when it comes to governance issues and information war, which I think it's an important conversation we need to probably push a little bit in. But going back to your main question on responses, and yes, there are peacekeeping missions, right, and different peace operations operating in Africa. But I'll try to narrow it a little bit to African responses, right, to this type of insecurity, mostly focusing on the regional approaches. And a couple of points that I wanted to highlight. First is the general trend that we see within the response. First, the trend in the nature of conflict. We can basically, from the previous speakers, we understand that the conflicts are not only local, have been more and more national and regional. So there is a trend on regionalization of insecurity and conflict. So which basically lead to the nature of the current responses that we see within the African Union as well as regional organizations, which is a regional responses to this either considered as internal insecurity or regional insecurity. Often we see them as internal insecurity with potential of regional insecurity. Here, for instance, I will pick a case of the DRC as well as Mozambique, for instance, where people think of it as an internal issue, but with regional implications. But often I would say it's not only that, it is a situation which is of regional concern. But so that is my first element to say the nature of responses, which is coming as a regional response, has to do with the assessment of the conflict, mostly considered as internal, but with regional implication. Who is responding to this conflict? Yes, the UN through MONUSCO and other peacekeeping missions, but I want to narrow it in regional organizations. We have, for instance, the SADC region, and we have the East African community that is deploying troops in the DRC, and then we have ECOWAS trying to address the issues in the Sahel and West Africa region. And so we see these regional bodies framing their security responses, but what is the big concern with that, and what is the big issue? First, we have to understand that almost all of these organizations were not created to be security-oriented organizations. They were created to be economic-oriented organizations. In other words, framed to improve economic operations. So security was more probably on the second or third layers of the priorities. So they framed the SADC region, for instance, was organization, the East African community were set up to address issues of regional economic integration. And yes, now they are facing a bigger challenge. So that's how it will reflect on the nature of responses. How do you transition from being primarily an economic organization, regional organization, into security organization, if we may put it that way? And what are the challenges and difficulties? As I said, they were created to address and promote economic cooperation. So the forces, resources, policy framework, and operational plans were economic oriented. But right now, the changing nature of the conflict pushes them to think out of the box, and how adaptive are they, or how adapted are they to the security situation on the ground is a question to be discussed probably later on. So on that point, they work on policy and regional organization and integration. But again, here's an important thing. Even when they try to address security issue, it is with an economic aim. For instance, in the Great Lakes region, when people talk about insecurity in the DRC and the East African community is trying to get involved, you will see the narrative is that we need to restore peace so that we may improve economic activity and improve economic status. So at some point, as I think Giovanni said, the point of where are the people in these conversations? So we're having some responses which are great security responses, but for economic aim and not social, probably local interest. So this is the trend and observation. And so what are the issues that we observe in terms of weak responses? One is the issues of leadership. Who is taking over? We see a lack of leadership in so many of these organizations, regional organizations and responses, because of course, there is internal conflict between head of state or internal issues on interpretation of governance issues. And I think Emily mentioned, for instance, case of Mali and other places, right? You have, on one side is the junta, a kind of military-oriented governance style, and the other side you have groups that are assuming to be more democratic. So how will they work together, cooperate, and provide the proper response? So you have the issues of leadership within this organization. The second issue, I think, is the issues of governance. So yes, responses are being put in place. For which type of governance should we promote? Are we importing the Western model of governance system, or are we looking into nurturing local governance models, which are mostly anchored into local expectations and local dynamics? And this constituted one of the biggest challenges in terms of sustainability of peace operation and sustainability of security responses. And I will probably try to hand with one key issue here, is the issues of trust. Yes, we have insecurity, we notice it, we identify it, and then we have another concern, the type of responses. And of course, being built at the regional level with local or national actors. But how do we trust this? So you have three levels of trust. Lack of trust between states. The DRC say, yes, East African community can intervene except troops from Rwanda. Hey, Rwanda say this is also our issue since it's in our region, right? And we have that thing happening. In case of Mozambique, the SADC region say we have to organize, have our troops deployed. But Rwanda did the bilateral agreement with the Mozambican government and deployed forces. And that clashed again at a level of trust between actors who are supposed to provide security. The second level of trust which needs to be addressed is the trust at the level of agenda for peace. Whose peace are we talking about? And are we talking about economic peace or political peace, where we reach a peace agreement and reintegrate these armed groups into the security sector system and then have the same thing? So we are still at that level as well of trusting the agenda of peace. That's why, for instance, UN peacekeeping missions and peacekeepers are being pushed out and pushed back. In the case of France as well, the Malian government say, hey, you have to leave. So all this is kind of an issue of trust in terms of the type of agenda for peace that these peacekeepers or these interveners are trying to project. And probably the last point I want to say is the trust at the level of people, trust from the people. Do you see local communities trusting these responses at the level of regional, national, as well as international? So we encounter that type of lack of trust. So many local communities don't trust their leadership. They don't trust the intent of either African Union, regional organization, or even the UN. So they don't trust that. And that becomes an issue if peace is not built from the local or within local system, local community. It becomes difficult to be sustained, even after serious deployment of international assistance and logistics. So this is kind of a little bit of a picture on the type of responses, the nature of responses, as well as some challenges and where we can pick in terms of strengthening the system and addressing and providing sustainable responses. Yeah, so I will stop there and looking forward to more questions and discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ivan. I thought was very interesting your point on the regional economic communities that are actually providing security, but without having that institutional framework and that origin for taking on that mandate. And I list here the features that you mentioned on the weak responses, on the lack of or weak leadership, as we often forget when we analyze armed conflict, that armed conflict goes hand in hand with domestic instability and with contentious domestic politics. And I think that that's a very, very important point that you made. What are or should be the governance models to export, and obviously with that being not very sound, and the lack and the different declinations in the lack of trust. So I hope we can get more into that in the discussion. Last but not least, Shurer Mohammed from University of Cambridge. What is your take on the current conflict dynamics? And we spoke on a different occasion about protractedness and about how protractedness is not only just conflict getting longer, but getting more complex and difficult and intractable. What's your take on this? Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much, Dr. Benjamin Petrini. Thank you to IISS for this fantastic conversation, and also to my co-panelists. I've learned quite a bit from just participating. I look forward to having a discussion with you all later. My own research considers land conflict in urban Somalia in particular, and thinks about how that continues to be a central issue in terms of political trajectories of physical and societal reconstruction. So I'm really excited to take the time here today to take a little bit of a wider lens and think about the politics of how protracted conflict is a key challenge that we need to consider. As you said, Benjamin, it's not just about giving a lens to time, but also giving a lens to the depth and the question of integratedness of conflict as a society-wide question. And so what do we mean by the protractedness of armed conflict? By this, I'm really speaking to recurrent crises of violence and armed conflict in the context of perhaps unresolved political settlements, instability, insurgency, and terrorism, or perhaps in response to external shocks, or exacerbated by external shocks, including conflict-driven, climate-driven rather, conflict or regional political shifts. What's really important to remember here is that I'm not advocating for a specific set time to determine where protractedness begins and ends. Instead, I'm thinking of it as Ellen Policzynski and Jovana Kuzmanovic suggest, as protracted conflicts might be episodic, cyclical, frozen, long-lived insurgencies, long-standing situations of occupation, or wars between states, or in certain contexts, conflicts that may appear to be resolved, but later relapse, as increasingly is the case for civil wars as their intervention. And through this, they kind of navigate three core ideas. One, within the question of protractedness, that there is a need to pay attention to increasing urban trends, new forms of technology, and the necessitation of wider humanitarian presence. The consequence of this concept of protracted armed conflict is that political violence is played out over the long durée, and deleterious effects on livelihoods, economic infrastructures, and the possibilities of developing mechanisms of governance that meet the needs of communities. And this kind of entrenchment is what I'm hoping to consider. I'm really glad as well to have had the opportunity to go after all of our esteemed colleagues, because a number of the different kind of political trajectories that I was hoping to highlight have already been covered, but perhaps as a quick intervention, because I know we also want to have some time for Q&A. As armed conflict on the continent rolls on from year to year or decade to decade, a key characteristic that I'm interested in is a question of increasing complexity. How increasing complexity can be either a result of the sheer numbers of communities, armed groups, or political exigencies involved, or, as we discussed earlier here, internationalization or intervention from external actors. So in Somalia, which is my particular area of expertise, of course, this is perhaps one of the longest examples of protracted conflict in the region. And as we've spoken about, it's the context of multiple overlapping trajectories of conflict in one context, right? Multiple shifts and bases of armed conflict from the start of the state collapse in 1991 to the current moment, where Al-Shabaab continues to hold large swaths of territory and conducts regular attacks in places such as Mogadishu. This happens overlaid with questions around city center periphery political challenges between the federal member states and with the national government, and in the context of a wider neighborhood, right? Regional security questions in relation to the neighbors, Ethiopia and Kenya, or the Gulf states interventions as well. So in other contexts as well, there's the question of this increasing complexity. In the Sahel, as was mentioned here, according to ACLED, 2022 is on track to be the deadliest year for civilians for both Burkina Faso and Mali since the Sahel crisis began more than a decade ago, right? And while there's much to be gained farther than particular incidences of violence, it's also important to consider the fact that more civilians were killed in the Central Sahel in the first 6 months of 2022 than in all of 2021, right? These kind of changing shifts are important to pay attention to. And the Lake Chad region, we also have multiple layered questions of crises. I'm just trying to get through because I know we will want to get to the discussion. Entrenchment and resumption of hostilities in Ethiopia, as well as continued tensions in the Great Lakes. One thing that I want to bring attention to is the question of territoriality, and I'll try to make some time to get to that at the very end. But it's important to think about some potential drivers, right, for protractedness and perhaps some of their consequences. There are many that many people have thought about quite extensively, including the proliferation of illicit economies, histories of political violence and grievance, as well as in the contemporary moment, and something that we need to pay increasing attention to, the question of climate-related exacerbations over the control of essential resources. But in certain cases, and I'd like to speak to one that I'm quite familiar with, there's a question that Emily did hint to, which is this idea of the ability to establish and construct parallel authorities, which in certain contexts are actually replete with judiciaries, with legislative functions, with relationship and embeddedness into local communities, which in some cases, communities can find to be more effective or efficient in particular kind of functions than the actual state in the community. And so this actually speaks to the ways in which African state territory or authority extends unevenly over geographical territory, right? And this necessitates a wider question around governance, not just military responses to uprooting particular security threats, but also the wider questions around how absence of governance, histories of state repression, and all of these other factors have collided in this kind of ambiguous multiple authority kind of context, what Dr. Giovanni was referring to as hybridity. The consequences of protracted armed conflict are many, of course. It's as this kind of increasing complexity continues, it becomes more difficult to unwind. And there are many consequences, including mass displacement, compounding humanitarian disasters. But one that I'd like to highlight that often doesn't get the attention that I think it should is the question of conflict-driven urbanization as a really important kind of critical comparative question across the continent, right? There's a scholar, Karen Buscher, who speaks to this idea of cities perhaps as critical arenas for the consideration of violent conflict, because in one hand, armed conflict process force mobility, but also that cities become either safe havens or concentrations of public administration and military apparatus, or that they present a magnification of multiple conflict outcomes, and that attention to conflict-driven urbanization is, particularly on a rapidly urbanizing continent, is an incredibly important thing. And she notes that this trajectory is something that can be seen in the context of Uganda, South Sudan, and DRC, that there's a direct correlation between urban growth and forced displacement. And to this, there are multiple other kind of interventions. So taken together, of course, protraction, the protractedness of armed conflict is a critical concern, alongside the many that we've spoken about, the internationalization, questions around stabilisation. And so really, I'd like to kind of leave you with a couple core questions around increased complexity over the longue durée, governance crises, but also the establishment of parallel authorities as important kind of outcomes, but also future-looking challenges when it comes to questions of protractedness, and also the processes and trends towards conflict-driven urbanization, which will likely be of paramount concern for our consideration for risk outlooks across the sub-Saharan African region. So I'll leave it there. I'm sure anything that I kind of cut out, we can get to in the question and answer, but thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you very much, Surer, for providing us with a conceptual and I think also operational definition of protractedness, because you put there a lot of analytical points and a lot of depth to the complexity at the domestic, at the international level, and the central question of what is governance today in modern societies, and what can the contribution from external and from domestic actors can be to improve that picture. I'll encourage our audience to put questions. There is already one or two, and we can probably combine some of the questions with just another round of remarks. So let me go back to you first, Emily. What in the sort of rich picture that you gave us on the hotspots, what are some of the contexts where you see potential de-escalation going forward, or where responses are sort of being more effective, and so countries that are on a trajectory to actually improve? And obviously feel free to react to anything that others said in terms of thoughts. And just two or 3 minutes, please.
Sure. Yeah, I'll be quick. So looking for examples that are actually trending potentially positively. A key question here, I think, is something that Dr. Ilunga got after, which is sustainable responses at the local level. And so you always have to go below the level of the national response to look for a potential sustainable response to an insurgency. And so one thing I'm watching closely that I briefly mentioned was the trajectory of events in central Somalia, because there has been a combination of state investment and local mobilization, which to me reads as more hopeful than, for example, only seeing the state level intervention that has tended not to be permanent. Another case that is worth watching closely for potential positives is northern Mozambique, which has not had great news this week, but there has been an intervention of a combination of regional forces and Mozambican forces over this last year that, at least in some sectors, has been more effective than others. I think the key factor will be trying to make all of the different components of the intervention effective. And as, for example, as IDPs look to return, there are some sectors that they are willing to return to and not others, which speaks to relationships with security forces and with service provision. So I think there are some pockets of success there. that could possibly be replicated. I'm less optimistic about the Sahel because of the issues with both the junta and the intervention of foreign forces that others have mentioned. I think that greatly complicates a kind of legitimate and trusted response.
Thank you. I actually find that this very enlightening, because you basically you go through some of the solutions of classical counterinsurgency in terms of winning hearts and minds at the local level and improving local level conditions, and that's sort of the first point of entry. So in combining, also looking at what the solutions are from the tools of interventions and policies that have been adopted, together with the context, with the new context that we have. Thank you for that. Giovanni, we look forward to hearing your policy ideas on sort of on the general questions that you put on the table.
Thank you, Benjamin. And I guess these two ideas are in line with the main points which were raised by my colleagues, so very much aligning to their assessment. What we emphasize at UISS as part of our analysis is to support rules and connectivity for the people. What do we mean by that? By rules, we mean that it is paramount to keep supporting, even against all odds, a rule-based international order. That's a key, not just symbolic, very practical priority from a political standpoint. But that also means upholding democratic, accountable, and transparent governance systems throughout the continent. Now, the what might not be it's been there already. It's nothing too original. We're not inventing the wheel here. What perhaps could change in the way international actors have promoted this is the how. So these values, this approach should be promoted not as a Western model, which obviously hasn't worked, but as a global value and also as a local value. For instance, by showing to African elites and governments and administrations how inclusive politics and citizen engagement can actually be assets for decision making, as well as to achieve peace dividends. I think there is a room there to have a different way to approach the issue of rule-based order, both from a global point of view, but also from the local side. And we have analysis at UISS that highlighted that there is a strong demand by African people to increase accountability. So meeting that demand will be absolutely crucial to have stabilizing effect. That's one point. The other point is about connectivity solutions, sustainable connectivity, and mobilization of the private sector to support, on the one hand, Africa's continental integration, for instance, starting with the African Continental Free Trade Area. Now, that can be an enormous enabler of stability because of the interdependencies it creates, because of the opportunities it creates for the African people. Let us remember that African economic structure for the moment remains heavily fragmented. This is one of the key reasons that makes African countries vulnerable to exogenous shocks, which in turn complicates the conflict situation. So the African Continental Free Trade Area is what setting stone for having this stabilizing effect. But also was mentioned by Dr. Surer before, promoting sustainable urbanization. We totally share that point and the importance of cities for the future of the African continent, given the demographic trends and also additional evidence. I will not go into depth now, but this is definitely a key point for us. And all this, hopefully, is one of the avenues to make African countries less vulnerable to shocks. And we anticipate that shocks may happen more frequently in the future in this multipolar world, and able to recover more quickly, and also able to be more, as I said, resilient. a resilient Africa will not just be beneficial for the continent, but needless to say, it will be beneficial to global stability. So that should be very high on international policy debates. And I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Giovanni. If I can just summarize, you propose sort of the long-term and the systemic change in terms of boosting sustainable development through trade integration, through sector and connectivity, and then re-establishing or establishing that rule-based order in terms of international norms that then lead to greater accountability in democracy, etc. Thank you. Thank you for that. Ivan, what are some of your further thoughts in terms of specifically about peacekeeping operations, and how do you see the landscape of UN-sanctioned peacekeeping operations at the moment on the continent, and how they are how do they struggle with this issue of mandate that you mentioned earlier, and the relationship with the regional economic communities? And also, if you have reactions to what anyone else said, please.
Great, thanks. If you may allow me to start with a quick few points on reactions, and then I will end with the current responses on peacekeeping. Well, I think I agree with the points that Giovanni make, and I think they are very great. However, there is a little bit of uneasiness, which I've personally observed when we think of how to, for instance, address African issues. And it's more kind of on a directional aspect of it, right? I'll just use a few key concepts. We have US-Africa relation, China-Africa relation, France-Africa relation, and Europe-Africa relation. But again, you know, the direction tells you where leaders and ideas come from and where they have to be implemented. Until we switch from US-Africa relation to Africa-US relations and Africa-France relationship, then we can start talking. Why? Because then we will understand that this is African issue, for instance, African solution, and the relationship with outside world is probably that of requesting support or assistance rather than embracing or receiving injunctions on how, for instance, to lead and to work. And these are important, especially when we think as well on the issues of governance. I definitely agree, and I have to say on the record, I support democracy and I support democratization. But again, we need to understand at some point that good governance does not always mean democracy, right? Because when we see the structural aspect of democratic practices in many of these countries is at the national or sometimes at the provincial level. Local communities don't have opportunity to vote, but some of them are well organized and operate in undemocratic spaces, and yet being effective in terms of satisfying the need of the locals. So that, for me, need further discussion in terms of reframing the democratic model or the governance model that we think may work. Of course, it cannot be generalized, but still need to be adapted to local context and local need. And this led me to the question of peacekeeping operations. Most of people say peacekeeping operations are not working. I subscribe to that analysis when we think on the timing of most of the peacekeeping missions. The MONUSCO has been in the DRC in multiple formats for more than 20 years. We have peacekeepers and peacekeeping mission in Central African Republic, and yet this country is still fragile. The question is why are they not restoring peace? And of course, because we think peace will be imported to these countries by ignoring some of the non-explicit local dynamics of the countries. in some places, the issue is not about armed conflict. It might be just an issue of identity frustration, ethnic frustration, which keeps a sense of fragility and ongoing conflict. But these are not framed in UN peacekeeping mandates. And the mandate is more at institutional building, strengthening institutions, security sector reforms, and so on. And those are great points, but they are not addressing all the local issues. And I will just start probably by saying this. We have the UN as a body in many of these countries, operating under many labels in terms of agencies. UNICEF is doing its own thing, UNDP is doing its own thing, and OCHA is doing its own thing. And then we have the UN peacekeeping mission doing their own thing. Lack of coordination poses serious problem. And this, it's also a big concern for regional responses, where we wonder if we may end up having another Sahel region in the Great Lakes, because we have so many actors, lack of responses, and we're not coordinating on response and while defining the peace mandate, which is supposed to be technically supported by everyone. So these are some of my personal observations, but I subscribe to rule-based society. But then the biggest question is who promote and who defend the rules, and where do these rules come from, and how do we as community accept that compromise and yet operate together in the pursuit of peace? Yeah.
Thank you, Ivan. I think you have a very important point about how these mandates are very prescriptive in a sense, and very rigid, and instead not adapting, at least from the level of the institutional mandate to the local context, that already hinders that response. And the duplication of efforts as well is an important issue to overcome, where I think that a lot has improved in that at that level in the last few years. There is a question from my old colleague Kaz Kuroda, actually several questions that are very complex, but I'll put them out there, and I'll turn to Surer after that. What about, ask Kaz Kuroda, the financing of conflicts? And are natural resources exploitation still playing a role? And the second question is on small arms flow. Where are they coming from? So anyone that want to have sort of a take at that, but first let me turn to Surer. If you want to provide some further comments on the territoriality, and anything that you want to add or respond to this question. Over to you. Yes. We only have just a couple of minutes left, and then maybe we can take a few minutes to go over the time at 15, and then we will close. Thank you.
Yes, I think just one point that I had hoped to get at that I didn't get time to get at, and I'll leave that question for people who want to take it, is the question. I really love this question about that Ivan gave us about the question of the rules-based international order and whose rules they are. I also want to kind of deconstruct that question just a tiny bit more. This politics of elite peacemaking and handshake deals in boardrooms, and that kind of challenge that we faced in this context itself. When we speak about the local, we also need to speak at a more devolved level than just about people who appear in the state. But we need to speak about communities. And I really appreciate the fact that Dr. Ivan gave us that intervention. That's really the only thing that I had hoped to get to in the question of protractedness, but I'll leave that question for others.
Thank you very much. I really agree with that. The peacemaking definitely has an elite part, but it has to be connected and respond to the people's needs and the conflict issues. Who wants to take a final word and maybe respond to the question, or have a final word?
I can take a quick crack at the question about both financing and weapons. I think the key point to take away is that the bulk of the money in the weapons are already there. And so cutting off external flows is not the difference maker. It's not that it's something should be ignored, and certainly there's a role for counter-terror finance and counter weapons smuggling, et cetera. But say if you look at Somalia as a case, most of Shabab's revenue is coming from its local operations, extortion, economic activity, et cetera. And there's a lot of weapons flowing throughout the Horn and across the Gulf of Aden via the Yemen war too. If you look at the Sahel, the flow of weapons out of Libya was initially an important thing, but at this point, decade later, the small arms that are most used are already present, and also these groups have largely developed the capability to build their explosive devices locally too. So the solutions remain kind of internal, and those external components to cut off flows are secondary.
Thank you, Emily. Giovanni or Ivan, you have a last word of wisdom, or both of you?
Just very quickly to say that on the, if I may, Ivan, unless you want to go first, but just.
No, go ahead.
Okay, thanks. Just a very quick word from my end, because on the issue of small arms and light weapons, we had an interesting scenario that was published as part of our African Futures 2030 Shayo paper, released by the UISS a couple of years ago, where the author of that chapter proposes a treaty on conventional forces in Africa, which would be aimed at curbing armaments proliferation and also stop somehow the illicit trafficking that results from different armaments policies throughout the continent, to make sure that, of course, the armaments issue does not go to the detriment of trade, investment, and development policies. So that was a very interesting scenario, which of course projects us into the future 10 years from now. But maybe, since the issue was raised during the Q&A, maybe a call for action to possibly kickstart an international reflection on this aspect, because it could contribute greatly to reduce this challenge. That's all from my end. Thanks.
Thank you, Giovanni. Ivan.
Well, just 30 seconds. I think on the natural resources issues, it is critical that we bring multinationals and economic operators within the conversation when we think about peace. Most of the peace agreements that we see being signed are often around and between political actors, armed groups, and yet we don't have multinational companies who benefit, for instance, from natural resources, or who operate or finance directly or indirectly some of these groups on the ground. So we don't often have them around tables. I guess it's important to start bringing that conversation and bringing them at the table, saying this is not only a political conflict, or these are not only political conflicts, they are also economic conflicts. You are active actors in this, and you should be at the table, and let's discuss together and then see ways in which we can make peace. So this is some of just a brief comment I want to say on natural resources. Thank you.
Well, we get to the end. I want to thank you very, very much, our four speakers. We hope to have you again and continue our interaction and conversations on these issues. I want to thank our audience, and there will be a recording of this event in the next day or so on our website, and stay tuned for our future events. Thank you all very, very much.